The world is full of places that defy explanation, locations where the line between myth and reality begins to blur. From the ancient house of the gods hidden in the clouds of Venezuela to the haunting, singing sands of the Gobi Desert, we are diving into 5 more stories that prove Earth is far more mysterious than we ever imagined. Let's explore. It looks wrong. Impossible. Like someone took a mountain, sliced the top off with a cosmic knife, and left it floating in the sky. A massive table of stone rising straight up through the clouds, its cliffs so vertical they might as well be walls, its summit so flat it could be a landing pad for gods. That's why we call them tepuis, says Antonio, my Peman guide, grinning at my expression. Because no human architect could have designed something so deliberate. Antonio was born in Tepuis, the small village at the base of Roraima, and he's been guiding climbers up this mountain since he was 16. He's now 42, which means he's made this trek hundreds of times. But he still pauses at certain points, staring up at the tepui like he's seeing it for the first time. My grandmother, he says as we rest beside a waterfall that tumbles down from somewhere impossibly high above us. She said the tepuis belonged to the Mawari, the ancestor spirits, and that living people who go up there risk never coming back. You mean dying? The old beliefs, they're not simple. The Mawari aren't evil spirits. They're our ancestors, our family. But they live in a different world now, and there are rules about mixing the worlds. He starts walking again, and I follow, trying to keep my breathing steady in the thin air of the Grand Savannah, the Great Savannah, which sits at 4,000 feet elevation and stretches for thousands of square kilometers, dotted with more than 100 tepuis rising like islands from a sea of grass. But the most important story, Antonio continues, the one every Piman child learns, is about Macunaíma and the Great Tree. You want to hear it? I absolutely want to hear it. We're on day 2 of the trek, still hours from the base of Roraima's cliffs, walking through landscape that shifts between savanna and cloud forest, crossing rivers that run clear and cold from the tepui above. Antonio has been pacing the story perfectly, revealing pieces of Pemon cosmology as we move deeper into sacred territory. In the beginning, he says, settling into the rhythm of a tale told many times, not just any tree. The tree of life, the axis mundi, the center of everything. It grew right here where Roraima stands now, and it was so tall its branches reached the clouds, so wide its roots stretched to the ocean. So old it had been here since the world began. He pauses to refill our water bottles from a stream. And this tree, it held everything. All the fruits and vegetables in the world grew on its branches. All the birds nested there. All the animals sheltered under it. It was paradise, abundance, perfection. The Piman people lived in its shade and never knew hunger, never knew want. The name means he who works by night, Antonio explains, and Macunaíma is the trickster creator of Piman mythology, neither fully good nor fully evil, but necessary, the force that breaks stasis and allows change. Macunaíma looked at the great tree and thought, "This is too much perfection." Humans are becoming lazy, complacent. They need to work for their food, need to plant and harvest and remember that abundance is a gift, not a right. So he decided to cut down the tree. Antonio demonstrates with a chopping motion. He worked at night. That's his way, working in darkness when no one can stop him. And he used an axe of stone, and he chopped and chopped and chopped for days, for weeks. The tree was so vast it took forever to cut through. We've stopped walking now, sitting on rocks while Antonio tells the story, and around us the grand savanna stretches away in all directions, golden grass, scattered palms, and in the distance, other tepuis rising like monuments to something beyond human scale. Finally, Antonio says, the tree fell. Can you imagine the sound? The crash? The earth shook. The sky split. And when the tree hit the ground, its crown smashed into pieces, scattering seeds and fruits and branches across the world. That's why different regions have different plants now. They were scattered by the fall of the great tree. I ask because I've read this part of the legend. And the flood, Antonio confirms. When the tree fell, it released all the water that had been trapped in its roots, in its trunk, in its branches. A deluge. Only a few Pemons survived, the ones who ran to high ground quickly enough. And that? Roraima is the stump, and the rivers that flow from it are the last waters of the flood, still running after all these ages. It's a beautiful myth, and like all good myths, it explains multiple things at once. The shape of the tepuis, flat-topped like stumps, the origin of cultivated plants scattered by the fall, the source of the rivers which do indeed flow from the tepuis, and the Pemon relationship with these mountains, sacred, dangerous, transformative. But here's what makes the story even more remarkable. The the geology backs it up. Sort of. The tepuis are remnants of a massive sandstone plateau that once covered this entire region. 2 billion years ago. Yes, billion, making them among the oldest exposed rock formations on Earth. This area was underwater, accumulating sediments. When the ocean receded and the land rose, what remained was a high plateau of incredibly hard sandstone. Then erosion began. Over hundreds of millions of years, water and wind carved away the softer rock, leaving only the most resistant sections, the tepuis. In a sense, they really are stumps. That's the ancient plateau. The myth and the geology are telling the same story in different languages. On day 3, we reached the base of Roraima's cliffs. And cliffs is an understatement. There's only one accessible route up. A natural ramp that early explorers called the only door to paradise. And even this route is steep, slippery, and treacherous. Antonio explains that the first non-Pimon to climb Roraima were British explorers, Everard Imthurn and Harry Perkins in 1884. They hired Pemon guides, but the guides refused to go all the way up. Too sacred, too dangerous. The Maori would be angry. So the British men went alone, found the route, reached the summit. And when they came back down alive, everyone was amazed. Antonio grins. Tonight, we camp here, at the base. Tomorrow, we climb to the top. And then you'll understand why the Piemont thought it was off limits. That night, lying in my tent at the base of the cliff, I think about thresholds. About how every culture has places marked as sacred, as belonging to the dead or the gods, as dangerous for the living to enter. And I think about how, in modernity, we've mostly lost that instinct. We climb everything, explore everywhere, assume that access is a right rather than a privilege granted by the spirits who dwell there. The Piemont concept of the Mawari is fascinating because it's not about good versus evil spirits. The Mawari are ancestors, their family. But they've crossed to the other side of death, and they live in the tepuis now, in the house of the gods, and there are rules about when and how the living can visit. You don't go casually. You don't go disrespectfully. Modern tourism has complicated this. Thousands of people now climb Roraima every year, most of them tourists with no connection to Piemont culture, no understanding of the sacred protocols. Antonio and other Piemont guides navigate this carefully. They make money from tourism, which their communities need, but they also try to maintain respect for the old beliefs. I always make an offering before we climb, Antonio had said earlier. Tobacco, usually. I leave it at the base of the cliff and say a prayer in Piemont, asking the Mawari for safe passage, promising to treat their home with respect. The tourists don't always understand, but I do it anyway. It's not for show, it's real. It takes 6 hours to ascend the natural ramp, a zigzagging route through a canyon system that winds up through the cliff face. The path is wet, slippery from the near-constant rain that falls on the tepuis. At several points, we have to scramble up near vertical sections where a fall would be. Problematic. But slowly, impossibly, we gain height. And about halfway up, something magical happens. We climb into the clouds. One moment we're below them, looking up at white mist. The next moment we're inside them, surrounded by drifting vapor. And then, suddenly, we're above them, emerging onto a ledge where the clouds form a solid-looking floor below us, and the summit of Roraima rises above. The world below is gone, Antonio says. Now we're in the Mawari's realm, different rules. The final section of climbing brings us to the summit, and stepping onto that plateau is like entering another planet. The surface is stone, not dirt, not vegetation, but black rock carved into bizarre formations by 2 billion years of rain. The rock is sandstone, but it's weathered into shapes that look organic. Mushroom formations, pinnacles, chasms, labyrinths. Water pools everywhere. Crystal clear pools of rainwater that reflect the clouds racing overhead. Mist drifts through constantly, obscuring and revealing the landscape in turns. And the life. Carnivorous plants grow in the rock crevices, pitcher plants with deadly traps for insects. Tiny black frogs hop across the stone, species found nowhere else on Earth. Strange orchids bloom in impossible places. The ecosystem here has been isolated for millions of years, evolving separately from the lowlands, creating endemic species that exist only on this summit. The Lost World, I murmur, referencing Arthur Conan Doyle's 1912 novel, which was inspired by early accounts of Roraima's exploration. Yes, Antonio says, but not lost. It was only lost to Europeans, to people who assumed that everything had to be accessible, explorable, knowable. We spend the afternoon walking across the summit. Though walking is generous, it's more like scrambling through a stone labyrinth, navigating around chasms, following vague paths that Antonio knows from dozens of previous trips. He shows me the Valley of Crystals, a stretch where quartz formations jut from the black stone, sparkling in the few moments when sun breaks through the clouds. He shows me the Triple Point, the exact spot where Venezuela, Brazil, and Guyana meet, marked by 3 countries' flags planted in stone. He shows me pools where the water is so clear you can see every pebble on the bottom, and where endemic fish species swim in complete isolation from the rest of the world. There are parts of this summit, Antonio says, that no human has ever walked. Chasms too deep to descend, cracks too narrow to enter. Areas too dangerous even for experienced climbers. The Maori keep their secrets there, and that's how it should be. Not everything needs to be explored. That night, we camp on the summit. Antonio builds a small fire from the dry wood we carried up, and we share a simple meal of rice and beans while outside, the mist swirls through the darkness. Can I tell you something? Shapes in the mist, figures moving between the rocks, sounds, voices maybe, or singing, but in a language I don't recognize. Like I'm being watched, like I'm being evaluated, judged on whether I belong here. The old beliefs, they don't always distinguish between the land and the spirits of the land. Maybe Roraima is alive in its own way. 2 billion years of existence. That's time enough to develop consciousness, perhaps. Time enough to have opinions about the tiny organisms crawling across its surface. He pokes the fire, sending sparks drifting up toward the cave ceiling. My grandmother said that everyone who climbs the tepuis is changed by it. You go up as one person. You come down as someone slightly different. The Mawari take something, maybe just a little bit of your old self, and they give you something in return. Wisdom, maybe, or perspective, or just the knowledge that there are places in the world that don't care about human concerns, that operate on timescales we can't comprehend, that were ancient when our species was born and will still be here when we're gone. That night, I dream of the great tree. I dream of Makunaima working in darkness, his stone axe biting into wood that has stood since the world began. I dream of the moment the tree starts to fall, that terrible slow-motion thunder, branches catching on the sky as the trunk topples. I dream of the flood, water exploding from the roots, from the heartwood, drowning the world while a few pemons scramble to higher ground, carrying seeds, carrying stories, carrying the knowledge that even paradise can end if change demands it. When I wake, the grand savanna stretches below like a golden ocean. Other tepuis rise in the distance. Kukanen, Ollantaytambo, home of Angel Falls, the world's highest waterfall. Dozens of others, each one flat-topped, each one an island above the clouds, each one a fragment of the ancient plateau that once connected them all. Stumps, I say to Antonio. The myth was right. They're stumps of the great tree. He nods, unsurprised. The old stories are always right if you know how to read them. Not literally always, but truthfully always. And the Mawari live here now, in the broken pieces of paradise, guarding what's left, waiting. For the world to be remade, for the day when the stumps will root again and paradise will return." He shrugs. Or maybe they're not waiting for anything. Maybe they're just being, the way mountains are, the way stone is. Maybe waiting and being are the same thing when you're 2 billion years old. We begin the descent, carefully reversing our route down the slippery ramp, back through the clouds, back to the world below. The return trip always feels faster. Gravity helps, and familiar terrain requires less attention. But at the base of the cliff, Antonio stops and performs a small ceremony. He takes tobacco from his pack, crumbles it onto a flat stone, and speaks in Pimon, thanking the mountain, thanking the Mawari, apologizing for any disrespect, asking for safe passage for all future climbers. "You think it matters?" I ask. "The offering, the prayer." The old stories are true. And standing there at the base of a 2 billion-year-old remnant of an ancient plateau, in a landscape that inspired myths of world trees and floods and trickster gods who remake reality, in the territory of the Pemon, who have lived here for centuries and understood something that modern science is only now confirming. Maybe the offerings do matter. Maybe respect isn't about belief, but about humility. Maybe acknowledging that some places are older, stranger, more significant than human concerns is simply accurate observation of reality. We walk back toward Parai Tepuis through golden afternoon light, through savanna that smells of grass and rain and space. Behind us, Roraima rises back into the clouds, resuming its role as island, as stump, as house of the gods. And the Mawari remain there, in the mist and the stone, in the crystal valleys and the impossible gardens, in 2 billion years of patient existence, watching over the last fragments of the great tree that Makunaima felled in darkness, waiting. If waiting is the right word, for the living to understand what the dead have always known. Some trees, even when cut down, never truly fall. Their roots go too deep. Their story goes too far back. Their presence is too vast to be ended by any axe, even one wielded by a god. The clouds drift. And above it all, floating in the sky, the islands that refuse to sink, keep their secrets, keep their vigil, keep their ancient watch over a world that was remade but not destroyed, that changed but did not end, that fell but somehow, impossibly, still stands. The forest that listened to music. The fisherman who found Orpheus's head says it was still singing. This is the part of the legend they tell you in Sigri, the small fishing village on the western coast of Lesvos, where the petrified forest begins. The head of the greatest musician who ever lived, torn from his body by frenzied maenads, thrown into a river, carried by currents through the Aegean, washed up on these shores, still playing his lyre, still singing mournful songs about his lost love. My grandmother knew the exact spot, says Nikos, gesturing toward the rocky beach where fishing boats bob in the morning light. There used to be a shrine there, she said, the Oracle of Orpheus. People came from as far as Babylon to hear prophecies spoken by a severed head that refused to stop singing. We're sitting outside a cafe in Sigri, drinking strong Greek coffee, and Nikohu runs tours of the petrified foresties, telling me why this place, more than anywhere else on Lesvos, is where music, poetry, and stone become one. Orpheus's music could move stones, he says, tapping ash from his cigarette. Literally move them. Trees would uproot themselves to get closer. Animals would forget to eat. Even the dead would pause in their journey to the underworld just to listen. So what happened when his head arrived here? I ask. "20 million years ago, this island was covered in forest. Subtropical forest sequoias, palms, cinnamon trees, things that don't grow in Greece anymore. And then the volcanoes erupted, covered everything in ash, preserved it perfectly, turned the entire forest to stone. But here's what the old people say, Nikos continues, leaning forward conspiratorially. The forest didn't just turn to stone because of volcanic ash. It turned to stone because it was listening. Not from fear, from awe, from the same spell that had always stopped everything rocks, rivers, wild animals when Orpheus played. The forest listened so hard it forgot how to be alive. The kind of story that makes geologists roll their eyes. Covering over 15,000 hectares in the western part of the island, it contains hundreds of fossilized tree trunks, some standing upright exactly where they grew 20 million years ago. Some fallen, some with roots and branches and leaves and even pine cones preserved in perfect detail. The largest petrified tree discovered so far is 19, 5 meters long. The trunks show incredible preservation. You can count the growth rings, identify the species, see the texture of bark that hasn't been bark for 20 million years. They're not gray or brown like ordinary fossils. They're red, yellow, black, orange, spectacular colors created by different minerals that replaced the organic material during fossilization. And here's the strange part. The preservation is too good. You can see individual cells under microscopic examination. You can identify insects that were crawling on the bark when the eruption happened. You can trace the exact patterns of wood grain, the precise shapes of leaves. It's as if the forest was frozen mid-breath. As if something happened so suddenly, so completely, that time stopped before decay could even begin. Theophrastus wrote about the fossils here, Nikos says, ordering another coffee. He was born on Lesvos around 370 BCE, right near where the forest is. He's considered the founder of botany, classified plants, studied how they grow, understood them better than anyone in the ancient world. And he wrote about the stones that used to be trees. He knew. 2,300 years ago, he looked at these fossils and understood they were once living wood. I knew about Theophrastus's works on plants are foundational to botanical science, and he was Aristotle's successor at the Lyceum. But I hadn't realized his connection to Lesvos, to this specific landscape of impossible stones. So maybe, Nikos says, smiling, maybe Theophrastus understood trees so well because he grew up near the forest that listened to Orpheus. Maybe the knowledge was in the stones themselves, waiting for someone smart enough to read it. The Natural History Museum of the Lesvos. Petrified Forest sits on the edge of Sigri, a modern building filled with spectacular specimens. I spend hours there marveling at cross-sections that look like abstract art swirls of red and yellow and black where wood grain used to be. There are complete trunks lying on their sides, so perfectly preserved you want to touch them, to test if they're really stone and not wood that was petrified yesterday. The curator, Maria, explains the geology patiently. Between 17 and 20 million years ago, during the Miocene epoch, this region was volcanically very active. Mount Lesbotha, main volcano erupted repeatedly. Each eruption sent pyroclastic flows across the island, covering the forests in hot ash and pumice. The organic material in the trees was gradually replaced by silica-rich groundwater, atom by atom, creating stone replicas that preserved every detail. It's called permineralization, she continues. The minerals fill the cellular structures before decay can happen. But the speed here, the completeness of preservation, it's unusual. Most petrified forests show evidence of partial decay, of slower processes. Here, everything happened fast, very fast, almost instantaneous. Maybe the conditions were just perfect, or maybe. She smiles, acknowledging the local legends. Maybe the forest really was listening to something. That afternoon, I hike into the main protected area of the Petrified Forest Park at Bali Alonia. The landscape is stark, almost lunar-low rolling hills covered in scrub vegetation, with massive stone trunks jutting up or lying scattered like the abandoned pillars of some titan's temple. The silence is profound. No birds sing. And everywhere, the trunks red, black, yellow, orange-rising from the earth like monuments to a world that ended 20 million years ago. I approach one of the standing trunks about 2 meters tall, maybe half a meter in diameter, leaning slightly as if exhausted from millennia of standing. The surface is smooth, glassy almost, showing the spiral pattern of bark that isn't bark anymore. I place my hand on it, half expecting warmth, expecting something alive. A quality to the silence around these trees that feels. People hear things here, says Andreas, a local shepherd. I meet as I'm wandering between the trunks. He's grazing a small flock of goats nearby, and he's clearly surprised to find anyone else in this remote section of the park. What kind of things? Sometimes at dawn, sometimes at dusk. Always the Samia melody, wordless, sad, beautiful, lasts maybe 30 seconds, then stops. My grandfather heard it too. He said it was Orpheus, still singing through the stones that listened to him. I ask if anyone has recorded it, investigated it scientifically. Andreas laughs. Who would believe us? They'd say it's wind through rock crevices, acoustic illusions, local folklore. But I know what I heard. Music from stones. The legend of Orpheus is woven through all of Lesvos. Near the town of Antissa, in the northwestern part of the island, there's a rocky outcrop where the oracle of Orpheus supposedly stood, where his head prophesied until Apollo, jealous of its rival's fame, commanded it to be silent and buried. Pilgrims came from across the ancient Greek world to consult this oracle. Questions about love, about war, about whether to plant barley or wheat. And the head would answer, singing responses in verses so beautiful that people would weep even as they learned terrible news. The oracle became so famous that Apollo's shrine at Delphi began losing visitors. Finally, the sun god himself came to Lesvos and commanded the head of Orpheus to stop. Whether out of respect for Apollo, who had been Orpheus's patron in life, or because 20 years of prophesying had exhausted even a severed head's energy, Orpheus fell silent. The oracle was closed. The head was buried. Sappho was born here around 630 BCE in the town of Erisosnot, far from the Petrified forest. Her poetry was celebrated throughout the ancient world, so influential that Plato called her the 10th Muse. Most of her work has been lost, surviving only in fragments. But what remains shows a poet of extraordinary emotional depth and technical skill. It's not coincidence, Nikos says when I mention Sappho. Orpheus brought music to the island. His head was here singing, teaching the stones to remember melody. And then Sappho was born, and she could hear what the stones remembered. All the great musicians and poets of Lesvos listening to what Orpheus left behind. The island today is still known for its music. The tavernes in Monoliths and Mytilene feature live music most nights. During religious festivals, the churches echo with Byzantine chanting that hasn't changed in 1,000 years. And throughout it all, the petrified forest stands, silent and colorful and impossible, preserved by volcanoes. On my last day, I visit the site at dawn. The Mediterranean stretches out to the west, gray-blue and endless. I sit beside one of the fallen trunks, massive, maybe 15 meters long, its internal structure exposed where it broke open millions of years ago. The growth rings are visible, compressed to stone, but still clearly marking each year of the tree's life before the eruption. $300, 500. And then, in a single day, in a single eruption, it was over. The ash fell. Became something that would last 20 million years, outliving not just its own species, but entire epochs of geological time. The silence is absolute. No wind. No birds. Just me and the stones and the growing light. Coming from nowhere and everywhere at once, lasting maybe 20 seconds before fading back into silence. Is it real? Wind through unseen crevices. Or is it really Orpheus's voice trapped in the stones that listened to him, released occasionally by some combination of temperature and humidity and the angle of the sun, playing back a recording 20 million years old? I don't know. I'll never know. Why they think the trees turned to stone, not just from volcanic ash, but from listening too hard to music that could move anything, even time itself. Theophrastus, growing up near these stone forests, learned to classify plants, learned that nature follows patterns, that life adapts and changes and can be understood through careful observation. Sappho, born in the shadow of the same stones, learned to write poetry that captured emotion so precisely it could make readers cry 2,000 years later. And every musician, every poet, every person who has ever stood among these impossible trees and felt the silence pressing down like something alive. The echo of the greatest musician who ever lived, still singing from inside the stones, still remembering when trees were trees and music could stop the world. The petrified forest of Lesvos is a scientific wonder, largest petrified forest on Earth, a UNESCO geopark, an unparalleled record of Miocene ecology. It tells us about volcanic processes, about fossilization, about what the Mediterranean looked like when giant sequoias grew where olive groves now stand. But it's also a mystery, a place where preservation is too perfect, where silence feels too heavy, where the locals hear music that shouldn't exist. Orpheus brought his head to these shores, still singing. The stones listened, and 20 million years later, the music plays, the legend persists, and somewhere in the red and black and yellow stone trunks scattered across the western hills of Lesvos, the greatest love song ever written is still being sung, note by note, waiting for ears that remember how to listen properly, for hearts that understand that some music is so powerful it can turn an entire forest to stone just by passing through. He's seen it in every season, every light, every weather condition. He knows exactly when to bank left, so passengers get the perfect view when the sun hits the sediment just right to make the colors most dramatic. But he's never figured out why some days the waterfall looks angry. Most days, it's beautiful, peaceful. The blues and greens swirling down into the abyss. But some days, maybe 5, 6 times a year, it looks different, darker. Like the ocean is trying to pull something down that doesn't want to go. We're flying south along the western coast of Mauritius, this tiny volcanic island in the Indian Ocean that's given the world dodo birds, rare pink pigeons, and now this, an optical illusion so perfect that it looks like the ocean itself has developed a waterfall, a massive cascade of water plunging down into abyssal depths. Jacques angles the helicopter toward Le Morne, Brabant, the UNESCO World Heritage Mountain that rises 506 meters straight up from the southwestern peninsula like a sleeping giant. And there, just off its coast, the underwater waterfall comes into view. My breath stops. From this height, from this angle, with the morning sun hitting the water perfectly, it looks exactly like a waterfall. Not metaphorically, not sort of. The turquoise waters of the lagoon seem to pour over an edge, cascading down in swirls of darker blue that suggest tremendous depth, tremendous force, tremendous motion. Your brain knows it's impossible. Waterfalls require gravity and height difference and falling water. The ocean is essentially level. This can't be real. But your eyes insist it is. Sand and silt, Jacques explains, his voice crackling through the headset. Currents pushing coastal sediment off the shelf into the deep ocean. The drop-off here goes from about 50 meters to over 4,000 meters. The Mascarene Plateau ends, and there's just He banks the helicopter slightly, changing our perspective, and the effect becomes even more dramatic. The waterfall seems to be flowing, to be moving, to be actively pulling the ocean down into some cosmic drain. But here's what the old fishermen say, Jacques continues. And I'm not saying I believe it, but I'm not saying I don't. They say it's souls. Enslaved people, brought from Madagascar, Mozambique, and other parts of East Africa, worked the sugar plantations that made the island wealthy. Many tried to escape, and some succeeded, finding refuge in the caves and overhangs on Le Morne Mountain, which was remote, difficult to access, and provided natural shelter. These escaped slaves, called Maroons, built communities in the mountains. They farmed small plots, hunted, fished, stayed hidden. Le Morne became known as a place of freedom, a sanctuary where those who refused to be owned could live on their own terms. Britain had abolished slavery in its colonies the year before, and officials were finally arriving at Le Morne to inform the Maroon community that they were free, that they could come down. They thought it was a raid, that they were about to be captured, re-enslaved, taken back to the hell they'd escaped from. So they jumped. Rather than accept re-enslavement, rather than surrender their hard-won freedom, By the time the officials reached the summit and made their intentions clear, it was too late. Freedom had arrived the same day as mass suicide, a devastating miscommunication that turned liberation into disaster. And that, Jacques says quietly, is when the underwater waterfall appeared. That when the maroons jumped, when their bodies hit the water, the ocean opened up to receive them. The waterfall is them, still falling, forever falling, their souls cascading down into the deep where they can never be enslaved again. I want to dismiss this as folklore, as the kind of story that grows around tragic events. But looking down at the swirling blues and purples of the waterfall, at the way it seems to be actively moving, pulling, flowing into darkness, I find I can't quite manage skepticism. After the helicopter tour, I meet with Madame Celeste, an elderly Creole woman who lives in the village of Le Morne and whose family has been there for generations. Descended, she says, from maroons who didn't jump, who made it down the mountain safely and learned, too late, that they were already free. My great-great-grandmother was on Le Morne that day, Madame Celeste says, serving me tea in her small house with its view of the mountain. She was 14 years old. She saw people jumping. She saw them choosing death over chains. And she said the ocean changed that day. It became deeper, hungrier. It wanted to protect the maroons who had jumped, wanted to take them somewhere safe, somewhere beyond reach. She shows me old photographs passed down through her family, grainy images of Le Morne from the early 1900s before it became a tourist destination. And in some of them, if you look carefully at the water off the coast, you can see something. Not as dramatic as the modern underwater waterfall, but a darkening, a swirl, a suggestion of depth. Every year, a little more visible, a little deeper. Like the ocean is still receiving them, still making room, still calling down anyone who would rather fall forever than accept chains. She explains that February 1 is now a national holiday in Mauritius, Abolition of Slavery Day, and every year ceremonies are held at Le Morne. People climb the mountain, lay flowers, sing traditional songs. And some people go out in boats to the spot where the underwater waterfall is most visible, and they pour offerings into the water. Rum, flowers, photos of ancestors who were enslaved. "We're feeding the waterfall," she says, honoring those who fell, telling them we remember, that we're free because of their sacrifice, that their choice meant something. Ocean currents really do push sand and silt off the edge of the Mascarene Plateau. The way light refracts through the clear lagoon water and hits the sediment really does create distinct color gradations that enhance the waterfall effect. But Mauritius has always been an island where the scientific and the spiritual coexist comfortably, where geology and legend tell different versions of the same truth. Madame Celeste takes me to meet her nephew, Yan, who runs diving expeditions around the island. He's explored the drop-off where the underwater waterfall appears, has descended into those depths with specialized equipment, has seen what lies beneath the illusion. The geology is straightforward, Yan explains. The Mascarene Plateau is the remains of an ancient supercontinent. Geologists call it Mauritia. It broke apart about 85 million years ago. What we see now are the peaks of that lost continent: Mauritius, Reunion, Rodriguez. The plateaus around these islands are shallow, 50 to 200 meters, but at the edges, sudden drop-offs. Here at Le Morne, it goes from 50 to 4,000 meters in a very short distance. The currents bring sediment to that edge, and gravity takes over. The sand cascades down the slope, never stops constant flow. From above, with sunlight, with clear water, it looks exactly like a waterfall. I prompt, sensing there's more. He hesitates, But when you're diving at the edge, when you're right at the drop-off looking down into that darkness, it doesn't feel like an illusion. It feels like something is pulling. Not physically. I'm not saying there's a current that will drag you down, but psychologically, spiritually. A group of historians had commissioned a dive to film the underwater waterfall from below, to capture footage of the sediment cascade for a documentary. Jan was the lead diver. And I could see it, the sand flowing down like a river, disappearing into darkness. Beautiful, mesmerizing. And then I heard singing. Underwater. We checked our equipment, no radio interference, everything functioning normally. But the singing continued. Sad, mournful, but also, somehow, triumphant. Like a victory song and a dirge at the same time. But Jan and his partner both heard it clearly. Both described the same melody. Both came up shaken. Some days belong to the dead. Mauritius is full of stories like this. Places where history and landscape have fused, where tragic events have left marks that science can't quite explain away. There's the Rogoman, the Mauritian werewolf, a creature from local folklore that combines African, European, and Indian legends into something uniquely Mauritian. Half human, half wolf, it supposedly prowls the forests at night. Older generations still warn children about staying out after dark, even in modern Port Louis with its streetlights and security. There's the 7 colored earths at Chamarel, sand dunes that display 7 distinct colors: red, brown, violet, green, blue, purple, yellow, that naturally separate into layers and never erode despite constant rain. Scientists explain it as iron and aluminum oxides, as volcanic rock decomposition, as unique soil composition. Locals say the earth is storing memories, that each color represents a different aspect of the island's history. Red for bloodshed, brown for labor, blue for the ocean that brought everyone here, green for hope. And there's Le Morne itself, that massive monolith that the UNESCO designation calls a symbol of the slaves' fight for freedom, their suffering, and their sacrifice. The mountain is considered sacred. Even today, traditional healers climb it to gather medicinal plants, and they always leave offerings, always ask permission, always thank the mountain for its protection of those who sought freedom. The underwater waterfall ties all these stories together. It's a geological phenomenon and a memorial, an optical illusion and a wound that won't heal, a tourist attraction and a site of pilgrimage. It's organized by a local heritage foundation, and it's not advertised. There are maybe 15 of us, mostly descendants of enslaved people, plus a few researchers and respectful tourists like me. The boat takes us out from Le Morne Beach, past the swimming areas, past the kite surfers catching wind in the lagoon, out to where the water changes from turquoise to deeper blue. From sea level, you can't see the underwater waterfall. You just see ocean, beautiful and calm, revealing nothing. But everyone on the boat knows what's below. The drop-off. She speaks in Creole, in French, in English, making sure everyone understands. She talks about memory, about how some tragedies are so large they mark the landscape itself, how the ocean remembers even when humans forget. People pour offerings into the water, flowers, frangipani, hibiscus. One woman pours a handful of sand from the seven-colored earths, watching it swirl away in the current. Anushka explains that the ceremony isn't about sadness. Yes, what happened here was tragedy. That's power. The boat is silent except for the water lapping against the hull. Someone begins singing. The melody is haunting, a minor key that somehow lifts at the end of each phrase, turning sorrow into something else. I think about Jacques' comment that some days the waterfall looks angry. I think about Madame Celeste's great-great-grandmother watching people jump and seeing the ocean open up to receive them. And I think about the Maroons on Lemorne, free but not knowing it, seeing armed men climbing toward them, making the split-second decision that freedom, even if it only lasted until the rocks below, was better than the alternative. Science tells us we're looking at sediment, at light refraction, at a fortunate combination of geography and current that creates a stunning illusion. And science is right. And legend is right too. Both are true. Both have always been true. The underwater waterfall is an optical illusion that looks like falling water because sand and silt cascade down a steep underwater slope. And the underwater waterfall is a memorial written in current and sediment and light. On the helicopter flight back, of course, she says, everyone who flies here knows them. Most pilots won't fly over it on February 1. Instruments acting weird, sudden turbulence from nowhere. Passengers getting emotional even when they don't know the history. That it's more than just sediment. not just in meters, but in meaning. I think when something that significant happens, when dozens of people choose death over slavery, when they jump into the ocean trusting it to receive them, that leaves a mark. Maybe not a mark we can measure with instruments. The blues and greens swirl into purples and blacks, creating the perfect illusion of falling water, of an ocean that's draining away into some cosmic void. But it's not draining, it's receiving. Taking in the memory of that day in 1835 when freedom and tragedy arrived together, when the choice was jump or submit, and dozens of souls chose the ocean over chains. The waterfall cascades, the sediment flows, the ocean remembers. And every year on February 1, descendants gather at Le Morne and at the water's edge, and they say, "We remember too. Your choice mattered. Your courage freed us. Thank you." The optical illusion is perfect. The memorial is eternal. And the ocean, vast, deep, remembering, continues its work, painting freedom in swirls of blue and purple, showing anyone who looks down from the sky what it looks like when the impossible becomes visible, when tragedy becomes beauty, when an ending becomes beauty, when an ending becomes a forever falling that looks from the right angle in the right light, exactly like a waterfall flowing through the heart of the sea. We're halfway up one of the massive sand dunes of Congarin Els, the Singing Dunes, in the southern Gobi Desert, and I'm sweating despite the dry air, my calves burning from climbing what feels like a sand mountain that doesn't want to be climbed. I listen. The ancestors. We're 3 days into the Gobi by Russian van, bouncing across a landscape so vast and empty, it makes you understand why Mongolians worship the sky. There's just so much of it. Batar is our guide, born in a gyr near these dunes, descended from generations of herders who grazed their camels and horses in the green strip, where the Kongorin River flows along the northern edge of this immense sea of sand. My grandmother, he continues, starting to climb again, she said the dunes weren't always here. She said they arrived. That they came from the west, blown by a storm that lasted 40 days and 40 nights, bringing sand from an ancient seabed that dried up before humans learned to speak. And in that sand, in every grain, is memory, memory of everything that ever was. Asks Sarah, one of the other travelers, a geology student from Canada who keeps trying to apply science to everything. Like memory, Batar says, smiling but firm. The sand remembers. And when the wind is right, when the dunes shift in just the right way, they sing what they remember. The lovers who met in secret, the children who played, the dying who whispered their last words. We reach the crest of the dune just as the sun is starting its descent. The view is insane. Dunes stretching in every direction, 80 kilometers of them, some rising 300 meters high, flowing like frozen waves of gold and copper, marked by wind ripples that look like the desert's fingerprints. Now, Batar says, sit. The wind picks up slightly, steady from the northwest, and the sound begins. At first, it's that same low hum, barely perceptible, but it grows, deepens, becomes something you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ears. Holy shit, breathes Marcus, a photographer from Brooklyn. It's real. The dunes are actually singing. The sound builds, adding harmonics, creating what almost sounds like voices. Not words exactly, but vocal tones, rising and falling, overlapping, creating something that's both alien and familiar, mechanical and organic, ancient and immediate. Sarah is already trying to explain it. It's the sand particles. When their uniform size and the moisture content is just right, avalanching sand creates acoustic resonance. The French did a study. There's a thin coating on the grains that... Shh, Bataar says gently. Don't explain it away yet, just listen. We listen. The singing continues for maybe 5 minutes, maybe longer. Time feels weird up here, elastic. The tones shift and flow, sometimes sounding like humming, sometimes like wind instruments, sometimes like voices chanting in a language that your body recognizes even though your mind doesn't understand. And then, as the wind shifts direction, it stops, just cuts off, leaving silence that feels loud after all that resonance. What did you hear? Bataar asks. Music, Marcus says. Just. Bataar nods, satisfied. That's what everyone hears. The scientists say it's just sand moving. But sand doesn't sing alone. It sings because it remembers being something else, being part of an ocean, being part of mountains, being walked on by dinosaurs, by ancient humans, by armies and caravans and herders and explorers. All that history, all that experience. And when conditions are right, it comes back out. And what I hear isn't random noise. It's organized. It's intentional. It's maybe they're just saying, we're here, we remember, we were witness. That night, camping at the base of the dunes near where the Congarin River creates a thin green oasis in all the sand, Batar tells us more stories around the fire while we eat mutton and drink fermented mare's milk that tastes like sour yogurt mixed with regret. The shamans used to come here, he says. Before Buddhism, before communism tried to erase everything. They'd climb to the highest point at dawn, make offerings of milk and meat, then wait for the dunes to sing. And in the singing, they'd hear answers to questions they'd asked. People experienced this, Batar corrects. You can believe or not believe what someone tells you. But when you experience something yourself, when you climb those dunes and hear them sing and your whole body feels it, belief becomes irrelevant. You know what you know. He throws another piece of dried camel dung on the fire, which burns surprisingly well and only smells a little. There's a story my grandmother told me about a man. This was maybe 100 years ago, who came to the dunes looking for his son. The son had left with a caravan heading to China, trading felt and leather. The caravan never arrived. No one knew what happened. sits there for 3 days and 3 nights, barely eating, barely drinking, just waiting for the dunes to sing. And on the 3rd night, they did. And he heard his son's voice. Not imagined it, heard it. His son saying goodbye, saying he was sorry, saying he'd been caught in a sandstorm and buried. But he wasn't afraid, just tired. The father came down from the dunes, Batar continues, and he stopped grieving, not because he wasn't sad, but because he'd heard his son. He knew the dunes had received him, had recorded his last thoughts, and would keep singing them forever. So his son wasn't really gone. Turned into sound, into memory, into something the sand would carry forward. Why not literally true? Batar asks. You already admit the dunes sing. You've heard them. You felt them. Why is it so impossible that they're singing what they've absorbed? Energy doesn't disappear. You learned this in school, yes. It transforms. Maybe human consciousness is just energy that the sand can absorb and later release. Maybe that's not supernatural. Maybe that's just physics we don't understand yet. We sit with that idea while the fire crackles, and somewhere in the distance, a camel makes that terrible groaning sound that makes them seem perpetually annoyed with existence. I can tell you facts, Batar says eventually. I guide tourists. I know what you want to hear. Congorin else is 100 kilometers long, up to 27 kilometers wide at the widest point. The sand comes from ancient mountains, ground down by wind and weather over millions of years. The singing happens when sand grains, which here are unusually round and uniform in size, cascade down the slopes, creating resonance in the air pockets between grains. The sound can reach 105 decibels, loud as a motorcycle. Scientists from France studied it, measured it, explained it. But that's like explaining a poem by counting the syllables. Yes, you understand the mechanics, but you miss this meaning, the why. I ask. Because silence, when you've experienced everything these dunes have experienced, when you've been ocean and mountain and desert, when you've felt dinosaurs walk across you and humans die on you, and civilizations rise and fall around you, silence would be unbearable. The dunes sing because memory demands expression. Because the dead want to be remembered. Because the universe itself is musical, and sand is just another instrument. It takes 2 hours. But the view from the top is worth it. The entire Gobi spread out. The Altai Mountains distant to the north. Nothing but space and light and that ridiculous huge Mongolian sky. We wait for the singing. That same deep hum, building into harmonics, creating that choir-like effect that makes your skin prickle and your eyes water even though you're not sure why. And sitting there, listening, I start to understand what batar means. Yes, it's sand particles creating acoustic resonance. Yes, it's physics. But it's also something else. It's beauty emerging from geology. It's time made audible. It's the desert speaking in the only language it knows, saying something that matters even if we can't quite translate it. Sarah, the geology student, is crying. Just tears running down her face while she listens. When the singing stops and I look at her questioningly, she says, "I know how it works. I understand the mechanism." But that doesn't make it less miraculous. Maybe it makes it more. The fact that blind physics and random chance can create something that sounds like this. On our last night near the dunes, an old herder visits our camp. His name is Oyun, and he's brought fresh yogurt and news about weather patterns, but mostly he comes because Batar mentioned we were interested in the singing. Oyun is probably 80. Face carved by wind and sun into a map of the desert itself. He speaks in Mongolian, Batar translating, but his gestures and expressions tell half the story by themselves. My mother, when she was pregnant with me, she climbed them every week. She said the singing helped me grow properly, that the ancestral voices were teaching me things before I was born. Superstition, maybe. But I've lived a long life and made good decisions, so maybe not superstition. Maybe the dunes really do teach. He tells us about the time 20 years ago when the dunes stopped singing for a whole summer. No one knew why. The wind still blew. The sand still moved, but no sound, just silence. Then, one day in autumn, the singing returned. Louder than ever, more complex than anyone remembered, and that winter was one of the harshest in decades. But because the herders had been warned, because they'd understood the silence as preparation and the return of singing as announcement, they'd prepared. Moved their animals to sheltered valleys early, stored extra feed, all survived. The dunes protect us, Oyun says. They warn us. They carry the wisdom of thousands of years of people living here, making mistakes, learning, surviving, and they share that wisdom through song. You think that's impossible, but you've heard them. We sit around the fire that night longer than usual, not wanting the experience to end. Tomorrow we'll drive north, back toward Ulaanbaatar, back to Wi-Fi and electricity and the strange modern world where sand is just sand and sound is just sound. But tonight we're still here, in a place where the desert sings with the voices of everyone who ever walked across it, where memory is stored in grains of silicon and released by wind, where the boundary between physics and magic is as thin as the line between sand and sky. Batar makes tea, passes around the metal bowl, continues teaching. Marco Polo wrote about these dunes, he says, about how travelers crossing the Gobi would hear voices calling their names, music playing, drums beating. He said demons lived in the desert, trying to lure people to their deaths. Maybe it was just the dunes singing what they'd recorded. All those previous travelers, their voices preserved, played back by wind and sand. How long does the recording last? Marcus asks. Like, if someone shouts on these dunes today, will it still be singing that shout in 1,000 years? Batar shrugs. Maybe every voice ever raised in this desert is still here, waiting for the right wind to release it. Maybe we're hearing the first humans to cross here, calling to each other in languages that died out before writing was invented. That's overwhelming. That's what memory is. Everything recorded, ready to be accessed when conditions align. And when they sing, they're playing back the archive, reminding us and themselves of what was, what is, what always will be, because it happened, and happening is permanent. Before we sleep, I climb alone to a small dune nearby, maybe 50 meters high, just wanting one more listen. The wind is gentle, not enough to trigger the full singing, but there's still that low hum, that subsonic vibration that you feel in your bones. I sit on the crest and listen, and I start to hear patterns in the sound, rhythms, repetitions. Something that might be language, or might be music, or might be the boundary between the two where meaning lives. Maybe both are right, because they're describing the same phenomenon from different angles. The dunes sing because they're ancient and full of memory, and the wind knows how to play them like an instrument. That's physics. But why does that physics create something that sounds intentional, meaningful, almost conscious? That's the part that makes you sit in sand at midnight, listening to a desert hum and wondering if maybe consciousness isn't just something humans have, but something the universe does, everywhere, in different forms, and we've just been too proud to listen properly. I fall asleep there on the dune, which is probably stupid, but I wake up fine hours later, covered in a thin layer of sand like the desert is claiming me, marking me as someone who listened. When I climb down to camp, Batar is already up making breakfast tea. He looks at me covered in sand and grins. "The dunes liked you," he says. "They were singing you to sleep." "I heard it," I tell him. I really heard it. Not just sound, something more. "Good," he says, handing me tea. "That means you learned what you came here to learn, that the world is stranger and more beautiful than we usually admit. That sand isn't just sand. That sound isn't just sound. That memory lives in places we don't expect. That the line between living and dead, between conscious and unconscious, between miraculous and mundane, that line is drawn by us, not by the universe." He gestures at the dunes, golden in early morning light, stretching away toward horizons that might as well be the edge of the world. And that these, he says, are not just geography, they're family. Ancestors, teachers, instruments played by wind, archives played by time. Proof that everything that happens leaves a mark, and that mark can sing if you know how to listen. Drive north, leaving the singing dunes behind, but carrying them forward too, because once you've heard sand speak, once you've felt desert resonate in your chest, once you've understood that geology and memory and music are just different words for the same thing, the dunes are still there, still singing, still carrying the voices of everyone who ever crossed them, still being played by wind like the oldest instrument on earth. Still teaching anyone willing to climb and sit and listen that the world is animated, that consciousness is everywhere, that memory is permanent, and that the boundary between science and spirit is just another dune, seems solid, seems real, but shifts when the wind blows right, revealing that what's on both sides was always the same thing. The ancestors sing in sand. The desert remembers everything. That's what the dunes teach. That's what the singing means. That's what you learn in the Gobi if you listen properly. Doc, the false men who wait for dawn. 3 travelers sat among the Callanish stones at twilight, sharing a thermos of tea. The wind was picking up. Moira, a local from Stornoway, was rolling her eyes at something Jake, the American, had just said. "No, no, no," Moira said. "You've got it all wrong. They're not aliens." I'm just saying the precision is. is what happens when you spend generations paying attention to the sky and actually caring about getting things right, Moira interrupted. My ancestors weren't stupid, Jake. Can we please not do the ancient aliens argument again? We did that at Stonehenge. We did it at the pyramids. Can we just, I don't know, appreciate the actual story? Thank you, Moira said. Finally, someone reasonable. "5,000 years, older than Stonehenge, Neolithic, blah blah." But why did they build them? Moira settled in, clearly pleased to be asked. Well now, that depends which story you want. The Christian story, the older story, or the story the stones themselves tell. The Christian story first, since it's shortest. See how the stones look almost like people. Tall, standing in a circle like they're having a conversation. The old monks said these were giants. Firbraig, the false men in Gaelic, who refused to convert to Christianity. Saint Kieran came here to preach, and when the giants wouldn't listen, wouldn't build him a church, he turned them all to stone. Cursed them to stand here forever as punishment. Can't have people worshipping the old gods, can we? Better to say the stones are frozen sinners than admit your ancestors knew things the church didn't. What about the older story? Elena asked. The older story says these stones were never human. They were always stones. But they were placed here by people who understood something we've mostly forgotten, that the land and the sky are connected. That if you watch carefully enough, the moon and the sun will teach you when to plant, when to harvest, when to celebrate, when to mourn. See that hill range over there? She pointed east, where the hills were just visible in the fading light. Look at its shape. People have been saying for centuries it looks like a woman lying down. The Callanish, the old goddess, the hag of winter. And these stones, they're positioned so that during the lunar standstill, which only happens every 18.6 years, the moon appears to travel along her body. Birth and death and birth again, all written in stone and sky. And every 18.6 years, it reaches its most extreme northern and southern points. The people who built this, they watched the sky long enough to figure that out. Just eyes and memory and probably hundreds of years of observation. And when that standstill happens, when the moon does its full performance, it aligns with these stones in ways that must have seemed miraculous. Like the stones were calling to the moon, and the moon was answering. They were quiet for a moment, watching the sky darken, watching the stones become silhouettes against the clouds. "You said there were 3 stories," Elena said. "What's the third?" I read something, Elena said. Now I've never seen it myself, never been here for midsummer dawn, always meant to, but haven't yet. But my gran. And she was not a woman given to fantasy, I'll tell you that. What did she see? She'd come here with a group of friends. They were young, bit drunk still from the night before, thought it would be a laugh to watch the sun rise at the stones. Everyone was joking around, not taking it seriously. Then the cuckoo called, and everything went quiet. Not just the people, the whole island. The birds stopped. Complete silence, like the world was holding its breath. Then he appeared. The Shining One. She described him as tall, impossibly tall, and bright. Not glowing exactly, but like he was made of early morning light, like he was the dawn rather than just standing in it. He walked down the avenue from there to here, moving between the stones like he was inspecting them, like a shepherd counting his flock. Jake asked. She said maybe 2 minutes, maybe less. And then the cuckoo called again and he was gone. the wind came back. Her friends started talking again, and they all looked at each other, wondering if they'd imagined it. Same figure, same walk, same impossible brightness. Could be the angle of the sun hitting the stones creates some kind of optical effect, light refracting in a way that looks like a figure. Could be atmospheric conditions, mist or temperature inversions, creating a mirage. Could be that after staying up all night drinking, young people see what they expect to see. Or, Jake prompted. Or it could be exactly what the old stories say. That appears when the astronomical conditions are right, when the sun and stones align just so to remind us that once this place was sacred, that it still is really. We've just forgotten how to see properly. One of the stones behind them caught the last light and seemed for a moment to glow. Right, Moira said. There are at least 3 circles here, Callanish 1, 2, and 3. This one, the main one, is Callanish 1. 13 stones in a circle, about 13 meters across, with that avenue heading north and shorter rows going east, west, and south. Makes a cross shape, though that's probably coincidence. This was built 2,000 years before Christianity reached Scotland. Callanish 2 and 3 are smaller nearby, within walking distance. This was clearly a significant landscape, a place people kept returning to, kept building at, for over 1,000 years. Jake asked. At least, then the circle around it, maybe a few hundred years later. Then the rows and avenues. Then, oddly, a chambered tomb was added inside the circle around 2500 BCE. Like they were layering rituals, building on top of older sacred ground, making it more complex. And then what? Eventually, yes. There's evidence of continued ritual use through the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, even into early Christian times. And then, sometime in the medieval period, it got buried. Buried. By the 1600s, they were covered up to about 5 feet deep. People still knew they were there. You could see the tops poking out, but they'd become part of the landscape. Mysterious, yes, but also just there, part of the moor. They weren't properly excavated until 1857. Imagine that moment, clearing away centuries of peat and revealing these massive stones, perfectly preserved, waiting. The waiting. Maybe they are, Elena replied. Not biologically, obviously, but alive in the sense that they carry meaning, that they hold memory, that they still do the job they were built for, connecting earth to sky, marking time, making people stop and think about things bigger than themselves. There's a local tradition about that, Moira said. People say the stones wake up at certain times. Midsummer, obviously, with the shining one, but also during the lunar standstill. And some say during winter solstice, when the sun shines through that gap in the hills. When they wake up, they're said to move. Not much, just turning, shifting, stretching like they're stiff from standing in one position too long. My gran used to say you could hear them. Said it sounded like stone rubbing against stone, very slow, very deliberate. But she also admitted she'd been standing here in freezing rain for 3 hours waiting for the solstice sunrise, so she might have been hearing her own joints creaking. They laughed. Do you feel anything here, like beyond just appreciating the architecture and history? Do you feel watched? Moira paused. Yes. Really? Jake asked. I've been coming here since I was a child. Played here, picnicked here, brought dates here when I was trying to impress them with mysterious ancient monuments. And yes, I always feel watched. Not threateningly. Not like I'm unwelcome. Like we're sharing the space rather than me just visiting it. Or maybe you're so used to being surrounded by noise and distractions that you've forgotten what real attention feels like. When you're in a place like this, when you're genuinely quiet and present, you start to notice things. The way time moves differently when you're not checking your phone every 3 minutes. And in that noticing, in that attention, maybe you sense something that's always here but usually drowned out. The presence of place, the consciousness of landscape. Whatever you want to call it. I felt it at the Acropolis too, Elena said, and at Angkor Wat. Places that have been sacred for so long that the sacredness has soaked into the ground itself. It's anthropology, psychology, maybe even physics we don't understand yet. Places where humans have focused attention, generation after generation, for thousands of years, those places change. They become more than the sum of their stones. The wind picked up again. One of the stones caught a strange angle of moonlight. The moon had just risen and threw a shadow that looked, for a moment, remarkably human. "Okay, that's creepy," Jake said. Moira grinned. "That's Lewis." makes you doubt what's real and what's story until you realize they might be the same thing. Elena asked. It went to the stones and let people milk it, 1 bucket per family every night, endless milk that saved them from starvation. Then a greedy witch showed up with a sieve instead of a bucket. The cow gave and gave and gave, filling the sieve that could never be filled, until finally the cow collapsed, exhausted. Then it stood up, walked back into the sea, and never returned. That the sea gives and the sea takes away. Take your pick, it's folklore. There are always multiple meanings. Or it's about knowing when enough is enough, Elena said, accepting the gift without demanding more than is offered. See, this is why I love these old stories. They're not simple. They just present a situation and let you figure out what it means to you right now in your life. The giants turn to stone for refusing to convert. That's about the clash between old and new beliefs, about what happens when you won't change with the times. The Shining One appearing at midsummer The white cow from the sea. That's about gratitude, limits, respecting the boundaries of generosity. All of these stories are happening simultaneously in the same stones. And depending on who you are and what you need to hear, one of them will resonate more than the others. Moira thought for a moment. That the past can speak to the present if we're paying attention. These stones have stood here for 5,000 years. 5,000 years. Think about that. When they were new, Egypt was just starting to build pyramids. Writing had barely been invented. Humans were still figuring out agriculture, cities, civilization. And these people, my ancestors, maybe, they looked at this windswept moor on this isolated island and said, "Here." This is where we'll mark the connection between earth and sky. We're still here. The moon was fully up now, bright and cold. The stones cast long shadows across the grass. "I think we should stay," Elena said. "Stay?" Jake asked. "Until dawn. If we're already here, if we've already come this far, let's see the sunrise." Maybe he appears other times too, and no one's around to see it. Maybe the stories are incomplete. Maybe we'll start our own story. It's going to be cold as hell, Jake said. It's Scotland, Moira replied. It's always cold as hell. But I've got more tea in the van. And if we're going to do this properly, I've got a bottle of single malt that should help. Let's wait for the dawn like people have been waiting for dawn at stone circles for 5,000 years. And if nothing happens, well, we've spent the night at one of the most beautiful places on Earth. That's not nothing. Then we'll have our own story to tell, Elena finished. Exactly, Moira said. They settled in for the night, passing the thermos, wrapping in blankets, watching the stones watch them back. The wind spoke in the gaps between the rocks. The moon climbed higher. Hours later, or maybe just minutes, it was hard to tell. The sky began to pale in the east. The stars faded. The stones became visible again, solid, patient, eternal. And somewhere in the distance, clear and certain, a cuckoo called.